I'm here with Jeff Maimon. Jeff, where are you based?
I'm based in the Boston area.
Oh, you're based in, okay,
Yep.
wonderful, wonderful. And thanks so much for joining me, Jeff. As we were talking before we started recording, you have so much insight into the Mussar world from your experience, and I really just appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me and tell me and everyone who will be listening to this a little bit more about your story. So how did you get involved in Mussar, and what has your journey been like since?
The former associate rabbi at my synagogue had been trained through the Mussar Institute, maybe going back almost 10 years. And so I had been involved in what we call our Center for Jewish Spirituality, and we were offering Mussar through that center, along with meditation and mindful movement and some other modalities. So I was asked to participate in sort of our first pilot session of Mussar way back when, and enjoyed it very much. We were using at that time Alan Moranis's book, Everyday Holiness, and the different chapters that cover the various traits. And I was still working full time, at that point in my life. And so, although I ended up reading that book kind of cover to cover myself, and I'd also read, I think, his autobiography, or however he refers to it, Climbing Jacob's Ladder, which was also interesting context to a little bit better understand like where Mussar came from and how he discovered it. So I certainly had the interest in it, although I hadn't devoted as much time to formal practice. And as I approached retiring from my first career, and I had become a certified coach and was working with people to help them grow and change. And one of my clients actually, her topic, like in the back of my head, I was like, I know I've read something that would be really helpful for this particular client. I'm like, oh yeah, the chapter on humility, like had some teaching that was very, very applicable to her topic as a coaching client. And the more I thought about it, the more I saw the connections between coaching, which is about helping people to change and grow, and Mussar, which is fundamentally to help people with their spiritual and personal growth. And so I thought it would be a nice complement to my coaching to become an instructor of Mussar. And so I reached out to the other instructors at my temple, and they were the ones that put me in touch with the Mussar Institute, and I learned more about the classes that were available, the train the trainers, so to speak, the Mount Hume program. Looking back at my coaching certification or my coaching methodology, it also involves like reflection questions and journaling. And so there were a number of elements that, in the school that I got certified in coaching has been around maybe 10 years, so not quite as long as Mussar. So it was quite interesting to me and reaffirming, I guess, of my certification, that they seem to have been borrowing from the wisdom of Mussar and people that understood, like, how do people actually change and what does it take to change? And so, it's about awareness and noticing things and being more intentional and focusing on that one thing, whatever the trait happens to be that you're studying. And then, the power of journaling, and, some people journal regularly and other people, it may be a challenge, but we try to support them in that by giving them prompts and questions to reflect on. Sort of staring at a white piece of paper can be daunting for some people, but if you have questions that you're actually thinking about and responding to, it's a little bit easier for some people to journal. So I found the classes that I took, that were structured based on TMI's materials, were very impactful. And then learning to become a facilitator with other people with lots of diverse backgrounds and so forth, but like meeting a group of people that are passionate about helping others was really a very sweet experience. And we've kind of kept in touch. We support one another. When we come across interesting articles or people have questions, they still can pose them to the group. We still have sort of a group that exists that meets from time to time, even though the training, ended several months ago. And so just having that support group of, again, like-minded people that want to support each other has been a very sweet experience for me. And it's so interesting because 10 people reading the same text might have 10 different interpretations or takeaways. And very often and even when I lead VODs, the old adage that you learn as much from teaching, but almost invariably, one of the participants will share an insight or make a comment or ask a question that, like, yeah, that hasn't come up before. That's a really interesting, question that you're posing. So I'm still, I mean, I'm a lifelong learner. I'm a student, right? As
Absolutely.
all of us are. So in that group, getting different, as I mentioned, different people with different perspectives and different backgrounds, like, made observations about the material that I'm like, oh, I hadn't even thought of that. That's a great insight. And so it certainly deepened my own learning by learning, in a group setting like that, as well
Yeah,
as with my Kavruta partner. I had a wonderful study partner, Kavruta partner, and he and I still meet, even though, again, the class ended several months ago. We still have regular sessions, and some of it's just catching up on life, and then we take turns, suggesting a trait to study for that particular meeting.
I wonder if you can speak to how Mussar has helped you
It's
change.
a little bit abstract for people to just, like, I want to be a better person. Like, okay, that's an admirable goal, but it can be a bit nebulous. And even people that say, like, I want to be a better person, probably have something in mind.
Right.
Certain situations in which they want to show up differently. But what I love about Musar is it actually gives you a structure to affect that change, and sort of a time-tested approach to facilitating that change
Mm.
in a way that's, very affirming. It's very gentle. There's a lot of stress on, like, not being so hard on ourselves.
Mm.
And so, fostering self-compassion and self-forgiveness, and recognizing that, we were created in God's image, but none of us are perfect. And so giving ourselves permission to make mistakes, but having a structure in place where you can say, like, well, I still notice that I can get very impatient at times. And so what's the teaching around patience, and what might I do? Or I still feel anger. And maybe sometimes that's a good thing, but not always. Or, how I channel that energy of anger to be productive, right? So it gives a structured approach to change. And I mentioned anger and patience, not that I think people would describe me as a horribly impatient or angry guy, but internally, I think I just managed those emotions. They didn't often boil up and result in sort of inappropriate behavior in the workplace or in my interpersonal relationships, but they were below the surface at times. And so just becoming, I think, more mindful of those emotions and finding healthier ways to channel them, I think, is probably what I've noticed Musar has helped me the most. You study sort of one midot at a time, and I don't think you realize the full benefit of Musar until you sort of have a suite of midot that you've got under your belt. Because in my experience, when you encounter a situation where it's unusual that only one trait would be in play in a particular situation. So when you feel triggered or challenged, and I give the example, there's someone that I have interacted with from time to time, and I think most people would just describe her as a very difficult person. She's always complaining. She's never happy with anything. She's very critical. And, when I first met her and had to deal with her, that was sort of my read. And it took me a while to realize, like, she's a very unhappy person. And, like, I've developed this compassion rather than judging her.
Yeah.
I've tried to take the time to understand, like, what is the source of her, unhappiness. And it's changed the way I speak with her. I'm sure the tone of my voice is different now when I interact with her. And so instead of some of those conversations becoming even more unpleasant and escalating, they tend, to be more productive.
Mm.
Because I think she can, I'm more empathetic and understanding. I try to listen at what's really the underlying issue that's bothering her, and not get too hung up on how she might be communicating, her feelings. And so I think that's a direct result of the Musar training. And so it's not just one trait, but it's, compassion, it's honor, it's patience, it's attentive listening. So there were so many traits that come together in life situations, and you don't always know exactly which trait it was that you studied that is in play at a particular moment. But as I mentioned, there's so many that complement one another.
Yes.
Um, in some of the more challenging situations. Sometimes it's very obvious, if you're stuck in traffic, it might be patience, or somebody cuts you off, it might be, anger or something. But in some of life's more complex situations, it's sort of like every trait that you study is one more tool in your toolbox, and then you can handle, life situation, the messier situations with, I'll say more finesse and in ways that are, don't contribute to making the situation worse.
And of course, from the Mussar understanding, we have all of these traits in us, and it's a matter of fine tuning, right? In the moment, as the situation presents itself. And I love that example you gave about, approaching this relationship with more curiosity and less judgmentalism, and that changing how you show up in that relationship, and being able to receive the other person with more compassion, more patience.
Yeah. So I think there's too many traits to mention that have helped me to grow, but the ones that I've mentioned around patience and managing my anger and compassion and honor, I think, are some of the earlier ones that we study, and I think there's a reason why they're in the first first year or so, because they come up quite often.
For those who aren't aware, we're talking about midot, these soul traits that are at the center of Mussar practice of learning to identify and balance these traits.
The Mussar teaching, often one of the frames that we look at the teachings is about how our relationships with others, manifest. And then, like, what about our relationship with ourselves? And then a relationship with, and I'll use God as a placeholder, but the divine, or an intelligence in the universe. And so that aspect of Mussar, which also leads to potentially spiritual growth. And I will say, like, you don't have to believe in God to study Mussar. But I think it may help you approach the question in new ways, and maybe will open up a person's mind to what it might look like to have a relationship or an understanding of something that's other than, what human beings can contemplate. So the midot that we were just discussing helped me quite a bit in the realm of my relationship with other people. There are others, like honor and humility and compassion, that have also helped me in my relationship with myself. And then there are some, like faith and trust and awe, that have helped me to, probably moved me from an agnostic to believing that there is something, although I'm still not sure what. So I think there's been like that spiritual, some of the traits, lead to maybe helping one in the spiritual aspects of their life, and thinking differently about God, or about like the intelligence in the universe. Again, the terminology can hang people up, and it's one of the most, as you probably know, one of the most interesting traits to study with a group, because people are on a spectrum of their beliefs. And I love to challenge. One of the things I had to learn as a facilitator was, it wasn't my job. I felt like it was my job to help people understand what the teaching was. Whether they choose to believe it or how it applies to them is up to them. And I think nowhere is that more relevant than like trust in God or faith, which, if they understand what the text is meant to convey, I feel like I've done my job. And if I've helped pose questions, and I'll give an example that came up in one of the VODs I led when we were discussing trust in God, and a number of the participants said, like, I don't believe in a version of God, like a man that's directing our affairs day to day, an old man with a beard and a white robe. And so you can ask yourself questions like, well, all right, so you don't believe in a God that could allow some of the horrors that we've observed at present and historically that take place. So that's not the kind of God you can believe in. I can respect that. Is there an idea or a concept of God that you could believe in that maybe doesn't direct the day-to-day affairs in each and every life? It gave us free will, that endowed us with certain capacities, but isn't going to tell us whether or how to use those capacities. What would the downside be in keeping an open mind? Like, if I can take somebody, and I don't have an objective other than to help people explore their own beliefs and feelings when it comes to some of these traits, but if I can get somebody to just acknowledge that, well, I don't know. So maybe, like, what's the downside? Is there a downside to believing that it's possible? Like, if I can get, and I don't mean, again, I'm not trying to proselytize, and Mussar isn't, in my mind, proselytizing,
Right.
although it has certainly had the effect for me of a much deeper love and appreciation for Judaism than I probably had before. So I'm more describing my own journey as it relates to those particular traits, that it just caused me to, like, boy, that's a little bit arrogant for me to be so sure about something that fundamentally I can't know. I'm a natural skeptic, but I sort of land on, well, life's more interesting if you would admit to the possibility that maybe those things that we can't explain do exist, as opposed to being so certain that they don't. And
Yeah.
going through life with that sort of sense of awe, I think it's Einstein that says you can go through life believing that nothing is a miracle or everything is a miracle. And like, I think that's a very sweet kind of way to think about some of these things, that, there are miracles. And whether you think they're just random events or somehow divinely inspired, you can still recognize them as being miraculous. So I'll leave the answer there for now.
You've mentioned in there how Mussar has helped you deepen your spirituality and your appreciation for Judaism. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
There's a line that I love from the prayer book that it says, pray as if everything depends on God, but act as if everything depends on you.
Oh,
And so, like, to me, that has a lot to do with, like, I'm not going to just wait for God to save me, so to speak, or to provide for me, but it doesn't mean that you can't pray and then also take action.
yes.
That
Yes.
line always sticks
So
with me.
important.
First of all, I have a different appreciation for just the wisdom of our traditions. Much of the somewhat more contemporary writing, or the writing of some of the Mussar masters, was based on either Torah or Midrash or Talmud. I mean, that's where they're deriving their sense of what it means to be, a mensch. That's one of the descriptions of Mussar, is like, it just helps us to become the best version of ourselves and to be a mensch. And so realizing that there's so much wisdom and really a deeper appreciation for the values that Judaism espouses through the character traits. So I think it's the appreciation for the values that you learn through Mussar, or have a different understanding through the practice of Mussar, that has given me that appreciation for the beauty. It's not as much about the rituals, many of which are beautiful and meaningful and comfortable and familiar. It's not specifically about understanding or dissecting Torah portions, but it's the practical application of those ancient teachings to our life, so it's actually making a difference in how I show up in the world and how I act. And so I think it's allowed Judaism to have I guess my appreciation for Judaism has become more explicit as a result of my Mussar practice and study. And then, if from that lens you might go read a story from the Bible, and you can see that character trait is being personified by Jonah or Noah or Abraham, but you have the context for why that story might have something to teach us today about how you behave, what it means to be a leader, or what it means to have faith. I did a talk at my Temple for Slichot on forgiveness, and I was sort of thinking, like, I don't know what I can say that's new about forgiveness, but when I looked at Maimonides' prescription, the steps involved in forgiveness, I don't remember the 4 steps exactly now. It's like acknowledging, your situation, acknowledging what you did wrong, committing, apologizing, committing to not do the same thing wrong, and then when the situation arises again, not doing, behaving differently. A little bit tongue-in-cheek, what I shared was, I'm not one to, criticize Maimonides, but I think he left out a step, which is like self-forgiveness, and maybe it's implicit. And so I ended up talking a lot about self-forgiveness and the importance of that, leading into Yom Kippur, and again, I mentioned before, what I love about the study and practice of Mussar is it is very gentle, and it's very affirming, and it's not meant to make any of us feel less than, but it gives us some instruction on how to show up differently, and to be, as I said before, the best versions of ourselves. So I think that's what's been most special about it for me, or most meaningful.
Yeah, and you're making me think how, at least from the perspective that seems both you and I know of the Mussar Institute, we focus on the positive traits, right, of shoring up and strengthening those, rather maybe than on the negative ones or the weaknesses, right? We work with the positive, and we try to view even more of those traits in our life.
One of the things that I love about how the Mussar Institute helps teach Mussar is we're reminded that many of these traits are on a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And so you don't get this sort of dogmatic, like there's only one way to be in the world, and that each of us might be in a different place in that range of behavior relative to the particular midah that we're studying. And that in a certain situation, like again, there's just not one way to always act. It's very contextual. And so there may be situations where anger is an appropriate response.
Right.
And then, as I mentioned before, it becomes what you do with that anger and how you act on it. There may be some situations that require more patience than others, right? Mm-hmm. So I love that it's not this dogmatic teaching that you have to be a certain way. It really helps foster sort of that self-awareness, self-introspection of, well, how do you show up in different situations? And there may be situations that you're very comfortable that you show up the way you want to show up, but maybe there are some situations that you'd like to show up a little differently. And then how can Mussar help you do that? So
Yeah.
To me, it's a very practical, relevant, it's probably the most relevant thing about Judaism, in terms of how it applies to my day-to-day life.
Every situation is unique, right? And therefore we always have more to learn, right? Because there is no one formula for living a life of kindness and compassion and patience and holiness, ultimately, right? And so that's why we have this life to work on ourselves in that way. What advice would you give to someone just stepping out on their journey? What would you say to that person?
For me, the best way to learn Mussar is in a group, for all the reasons that we talked about before. And so I know that the Mussar Institute, offers, I believe it's called Pathways now. And it's not a huge commitment of time. I don't know exactly, it might be 6, 7, 8 weeks, something like that. But it's, for most people, it's manageable, and you can set aside the amount of time. If people are worried about the time commitment, I would just say that the time you save as a result of better interpersonal relationships and fewer misunderstandings and fewer needs for apologies and sending rectifying emails and on. Like, I think the time you invest in Mussar and the benefits that you derive more than pay for themselves, and sort of time saved in anguish and frustration and unproductive human relationships. So I think, take one of the classes. I think TMI is also now offering sort of smaller, even like Mussar in small doses. But I would caution someone, like, you get out of it what you put into it. And so, try to do it at a time in your life that you can commit to doing the reading and showing up for the live sessions and meeting with your study partner. And it's, we're not talking about tens of hours per week. It's for me, it was a smaller commitment than that, but it was certainly worthwhile. So for some people, reading the book, is certainly a good start. It might get you interested in it, but I think, I've used the word practice many times, because I don't think Mussar is something that you study and just intellectually understand. It's something that you have to sort of practice and take to your heart. Yes. And really feel at a different level. And that's, most change happens when your heart is affected, not just your head. And so I think Mussar helps connect the head with the heart. And I'm pretty sure I'm quoting Alan there. So I'm not, or maybe Alan had quoted someone else, but I think Mussar does that quite effectively. And so, I would say, like, dip your toe in and get started. And most of the people, once they're exposed to it, are hooked. And a lot of the VODs continue to meet even after the class is over. And the other thing is, like, it's an opportunity to meet some new people and form some, as you mentioned, form some friendships. If it's offered through your synagogue, it's a chance to get to know other congregants, maybe in a different way, in a very safe and nurturing environment. So I think there are so many benefits in addition to the, for people, at least my synagogue, like, people feel like they've made new friends and gotten to know people. And so I think we've seen the benefit of that in terms of community building as well. There are so many studies now that link career success to not only IQ, but more importantly, EQ and leadership. And so I think so much of the Mussar teaching will not only helps one personally, but I think professionally. And so as I think about the various traits, I think it enhances your emotional intelligence for dealing with different situations. And I think, I think a lot of the teaching would have made me a much better leader in my professional career. In terms of compassion and listening, and yes, it's spiritual growth, and it's also personal growth, but I think it's personal growth that will help people be successful and more balanced in their life, both personally and professionally. And so had I been exposed to it, in my 20s or 30s instead of in my 50s, I can think of many situations at work that I probably would have handled differently today than I did at the time.
It's an unending journey, right? We are wherever we are on the path, and there's always further to go. And so maybe to conclude this conversation, where do you see this journey taking you in the future, Jeff? What do you see as your next steps?
We've talked quite a bit about the benefits to interpersonal relationships. And I think we can't underestimate how our interactions affect other people. And so, so to the extent that my interactions with my children or with my parents or other friends and loved ones, are enhanced by virtue of the practice, I think there's sort of that, whether it's osmosis, those other, my kids haven't studied Mussar, but hopefully I'm role modeling, better behavior for them than I might otherwise have been role modeling. And so, and then, it's just there's so much good material out there on Mussar, and so I feel like I'm always learning, and people are sending me articles, and I spend a little bit of time. And this year, I did for the first time the 60-day Elul journey through a Mussar lens. Like in the past, my high holiday preparation probably consisted of trying to find a parking space, at the synagogue and getting there on time and getting one of the comfortable seats instead of one of the rented seats. And and so like you don't get quite as much out of the service maybe when your preparation was as lacking in many years as mine was. And taking the time to be just more thoughtful about Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur made those holidays much more meaningful for me. And we're going to be offering classes in advance of several other holidays this year to help people really derive the full benefit of our rituals and practices and celebrations. So I think the road ahead, I think it will continue to inform how I come to understand, Judaism and all of its rituals and whatnot.
I want to thank you, Jeff, for this conversation. I find myself saying this every time, but really I get so much from these conversations. I hope that people will be listening, and I know that they will be, but I just want you to know that personally, I benefit so much from your wisdom, what you have to share. And I'm jealous of those in your VOD who you facilitate. They are so lucky to have you as a guide on this path.
No, thank you for your kind words. I've enjoyed our conversation as well.